If you have never experienced springtime in Cary, North Carolina, let me paint you a very vivid, very yellow picture. It is not just a season down here. It is a biological event. Right around mid-April, the pine trees decide it is time to reproduce, and they do so by unleashing a toxic, neon yellow cloud of pollen that blankets everything in a 3-mile radius. I am talking about a thick, powdery film that coats your car, your patio furniture, your windows, and the very inside of your lungs. You do not breathe air in Cary during the spring. You breathe a botanical particulate suspension. It was a Tuesday morning, a beautiful, crisp Tuesday morning, if you ignored the yellow fog. I was standing in my own driveway, on my own property, holding my own cup of black coffee. I had just walked out to grab the mail. I was wearing basketball shorts and a tattered gray t-shirt that had seen better days. I was minding my own business. I was a man at peace with the world, simply trying to wake up before logging onto my computer for the day. But my body had other plans. I felt it start deep in my sinuses. A subtle tickle. A tiny, microscopic grain of pine pollen had bypassed my nasal defenses and lodged itself directly onto a sensitive nerve ending. I tried to ignore it. I took a sip of coffee, hoping the hot liquid would somehow steam the problem away. It did not. The tickle grew. It expanded. It mutated into an unbearable, overwhelming pressure behind my eyes. My breath hitched. I set my coffee mug down on the hood of my car, which was currently the color of a highlighter pen. I pinched the bridge of my nose. I tried to look up at the sun, a trick my grandfather taught me that supposedly stops a sneeze dead in its tracks. The sun did nothing. The pressure built. It was a tidal wave of biological necessity. I could not stop it. I did not want to stop it. I am a grown man on my own driveway. If I want to sneeze, I am going to sneeze. I leaned back, inhaled a massive gulp of pollen-laced air, and let it rip. Achoo! It was a good sneeze. A solid, chest-clearing, resonant sneeze. Was it loud? Sure. I am a big guy with a decent set of lungs. It had some bass to it. It echoed slightly off the aluminum siding of my detached garage. But it was just a sneeze. It was a standard, run-of-the-mill expulsion of air. It was not a sonic boom. It did not shatter glass. It did not trigger any seismic sensors at the local university. I sniffled, wiped my nose with the back of my hand, and picked up my coffee. I felt instantly better. The sinus pressure was gone. I took a deep, satisfying breath. Excuse me! The voice cut through the quiet suburban morning like a rusty bandsaw hitting a nail. It was shrill. It was indignant. It was vibrating with an intensity that immediately made my shoulders tense up. I slowly turned my head toward the property line. My house is separated from the house next door by a 6-foot privacy fence. It is a good fence, a sturdy fence, a fence designed specifically to keep my business on my side and my neighbor's business on hers. But there, hovering over the top of the 6-foot wooden planks like a very angry, heavily caffeinated gargoyle, was Brenda. Brenda is a woman who treats the Homeowners Association bylaws as her personal religious text. She has the kind of haircut that demands to speak to a manager, and she always wears athleisure wear despite never seemingly engaging in any athletic leisure. To achieve this current vantage point, she was clearly standing on a step stool on her side of the fence. She was holding a steaming mug of something decaf and disappointing, her knuckles white as she gripped the ceramic handle. Her eyes were narrowed into tiny slits of pure, unadulterated fury. "Did you really have to do that?" she snapped, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. I blinked. I looked around my empty driveway. I looked back at her. Do what, Brenda? Get the mail? Do not play coy with me, she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me over the fence line. That explosion, that disgusting, aggressive bodily explosion. I genuinely laughed. I could not help it. It was too absurd. You mean, my sneeze? You're upset that I sneezed. It was not a sneeze, Brenda yelled, leaning further over the fence. It was a deliberate act of acoustic violence. You are practically shouting at the top of your lungs. You are projecting your germs and your hostility directly into my yard. Brenda, I sneezed, I said, my smile fading. I was tired. I had not had enough coffee, and I was losing my patience. It's pollen season. Everything is yellow. I inhaled a tree, and my body rejected it. That is how biology works. I do not care about your biology, she screeched. My baby was asleep. You just woke up my baby with your aggressive nasal outbursts. Now, here is the thing about Brenda's baby. Brenda does not have an infant child. Brenda's children are all grown and living in other states, presumably to get as far away from her as physically possible. When Brenda refers to her baby, she is referring to Barnaby. Barnaby is a 14-year-old Yorkshire Terrier who has cataracts, severe arthritis, and is entirely deaf. Barnaby sleeps 23 hours a day and could sleep through a tactical airstrike. Brenda, Barnaby is deaf, I pointed out, leaning against my car. He literally cannot hear a vacuum cleaner right next to his head. He didn't hear me sneeze. How dare you bring Barnaby's medical conditions into this? She gasped, clutching an imaginary string of pearls at her throat. The vibrations woke him. The sheer kinetic force of your barbaric shouting startled his fragile nervous system. He is shaking. He's shaking because he's a Yorkie, Brenda. That's what they do. They shake. I am not going to stand here and be insulted by a man who refuses to control his own bodily functions, she declared, puffing out her chest. You are creating a hostile living environment. You are violating the quiet enjoyment of my property. I am standing on my own driveway, I said, my voice dropping an octave. The humor was entirely gone now. I am allowed to sneeze on my own property. Not at that volume, you aren't, she countered, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. There are rules in this neighborhood. There are ordinances. You need to go inside, shut your windows, and sneeze into a pillow like a civilized person. If you can't be quiet, you don't belong outside. I stared at her. I just stared. I tried to process the absolute mind-bending audacity of a human being telling another human being to go indoors and muffle their sneezes into a pillow so as not to disturb a deaf dog. I'm not doing that, Brenda, I said flatly. Then you leave me no choice, she said, her voice dropping into a dramatic whisper. I am calling the authorities. You are disturbing the peace. You are violating the Cary Municipal Noise Ordinance. We will see what the police have to say about your acoustic violence. She slammed her mug down on the top of the fence, almost spilling it, and disappeared from view. I heard the clatter of her step stool as she kicked it away, followed by the heavy slam of her back door. I stood in my driveway for a long moment. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm now. She was calling the cops. Over a sneeze. A normal person would have gone inside, locked the door, and ignored her. A normal person would have chalked it up to crazy neighbor syndrome and moved on with their day. But I am not a normal person. And as I stood there, looking at the 6-foot privacy fence, a devious, wonderfully petty idea started brewing in the back of my mind. You want to hear acoustic violence, Brenda? I thought, a slow smile spreading across my face. You want to weaponize the municipal noise ordinance against a sneeze? Okay, let's play the ordinance game. I did not go inside. I went to the front porch, sat down in my rocking chair, and waited. I wanted a front row seat to this circus. It took exactly 32 minutes for the Cary Police Department to arrive. I saw them turn onto the cul-de-sac. 2 cruisers, lights flashing, though no sirens. They pulled up in front of Brenda's house, parking at an awkward angle. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicles. Officer Davis was an older guy, maybe in his late 40s, with a thick mustache and the deeply exhausted look of a man who was counting the days until his pension kicked in. Officer Miller was younger, probably fresh out of the academy, looking eager but slightly confused. They adjusted their duty belts and looked around the quiet, sun-drenched suburban street. Nothing was on fire. No one was screaming. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the pollen-heavy pine trees. They walked up Brenda's perfectly manicured walkway and rang the bell. The door flew open before they could even lower their hands. Brenda launched into the performance of a lifetime. I couldn't hear every single word from my porch, but I could hear the cadence. She was gesturing wildly, pointing at my house, pointing at her own ears, pointing at the sky. At one point, she actually held up her hands and physically mimed a massive explosion expanding outward. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. She looked like a survivor, recounting the final days of Pompeii. Officer Davis stood there, his thumbs hooked into his belt, nodding slowly. His face was a mask of professional apathy. Officer Miller was furiously taking notes on a small pad, looking highly concerned. After about 5 minutes of this one-woman off-Broadway show, Davis patted the air, signaling Brenda to calm down. He nodded again, said something to her, and then both officers turned and began walking across the lawns toward my house. I remained seated in my rocking chair. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Morning, officers," I called out as they approached my driveway. Officer Davis sighed heavily as he walked up the path. "Good morning, sir. Are you the homeowner?" "I am," I said, setting my mug down on the small table next to me. "We received a call about a disturbance," Davis said, his tone incredibly flat. He did not want to be here. He knew exactly what this was. "Let me guess," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my knees. "The sneeze." Officer Miller stopped writing and looked up from his notepad, his brow furrowed. "The sneeze?" "Yes, sir," Officer Davis said, closing his eyes for a brief second, as if praying for strength. "The sneeze." "I was standing right about there," I said, pointing to the spot on the driveway. "I sneezed. It was loud. It's pollen season. My neighbor Brenda claimed it was an act of acoustic violence, and that the kinetic shockwaves startled her deaf Yorkie." Miller looked back at Brenda's house, then back at me. "Wait, you just sneezed? That's it? There was no shouting match? No threats?" "No threats from my end," I corrected him. "She told me I needed to go inside and sneeze into a pillow. When I refused, she said she was calling you guys for a noise ordinance violation." Davis rubbed his temples. "Sir, I'm going to be straight with you. Mrs. Higgins over there is very upset. She claims you are intentionally making loud, sudden noises to harass her." "Officer Davis, look at my car," I said, pointing to the yellow sedan. "Look at the air. I have allergies. I cannot control when my body needs to expel an irritant." "I understand that, sir," Davis said, adopting a diplomatic tone. "And obviously we are not going to arrest you for sneezing. But she is invoking the Cary Municipal Code regarding nuisance noises." "Is she now?" I asked, my interest suddenly piqued. "Yes," Miller chimed in, reading from his notepad. She specifically cited the ordinance stating that any loud, jarring, or sudden noise that unreasonably disturbs the peace, quiet, and comfort of the neighboring inhabitants is a violation. And a sneeze counts as a jarring noise, I asked, raising an eyebrow. Technically, Davis said, sounding completely defeated. If a noise is sudden, lacks a steady rhythm, and exceeds a certain ambient decibel level, and a neighbor files a formal complaint that it disturbed their peace. Yes. Technically, it can be considered a nuisance noise. It's a very broad ordinance. I sat back in my chair. I processed that information. I turned it over in my mind, looking at it from every angle. The law was broad, the law was subjective. The law said that if a noise was sudden and jarring, it was illegal. So any noise that is suddenly jarring and disturbs her is a violation? I asked, posing it as a rhetorical question, though I wanted them on the record. In a residential zone, during daytime hours, yes, if it exceeds the ambient threshold and causes a disturbance, Miller confirmed earnestly. Okay, I said slowly. So what happens now? Now, Davis said, stepping back off the porch. We have investigated the complaint. We have spoken to both parties. I am issuing you a verbal warning to try and keep the noise down. If you feel a sneeze coming on, maybe try to head indoors. It's the neighborly thing to do. A verbal warning, I repeated. For sneezing. It's just to document that we responded and addressed the complaint, sir, Davis said, practically begging me not to escalate the situation with him. He just wanted to clear the call and go get a donut. Please, just try to keep the peace. We really don't want to have to come back out here for this. Understood, Officer Davis, I said, standing up. I completely understand the municipal code now. You have been very helpful. Have a safe shift. The officers walked back to their cars. Brenda was standing on her front porch, arms crossed, watching them with a smug, self-satisfied look on her face. She saw the cops talk to me. She saw them point at my house. In her mind, she had won. She had successfully weaponized the local government against my respiratory system. I watched the cruisers pull away. I looked over at Brenda. She caught my eye, gave me a triumphant little smirk, and turned around to walk back inside her house. I did not smirk back. I just stared at her closing door. A sudden jarring noise that disturbs the peace. The cops had practically handed me the playbook. They had confirmed that the local ordinance was incredibly strict about sudden noises in a residential zone. But I am not just a homeowner. I am a guy who understands that every single local ordinance in the United States of America has exemptions. Every law has a loophole. You just have to be willing to read the fine print. If I had to suppress my natural bodily functions because they violated the noise ordinance, then I needed to find a legal cover to make some real, undeniable, earth-shattering noise. I needed a reason, a legally bulletproof reason, to unleash acoustic hell on this cul-de-sac. I turned around, walked into my house, and locked the front door. I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't go to the living room. I walked straight into my home office, booted up my computer, and opened a web browser. I cracked my knuckles. Let's see what you've got, Carrie, I muttered to the empty room. I pulled up the official database for the Cary Code of Ordinances. I bypassed the standard residential bylaws and went straight to Chapter 22. Environment. Article 3. Noise. I scrolled past the definitions. I scrolled past the prohibited acts. I scrolled past the specific decibel limits for residential boundaries. I was looking for one specific word. Exemptions. There it was. Section 22-105. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. A. The following sources of noise are exempt from the provisions of this article. I read through the list. Construction equipment between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Exempt. Lawn mowers and agricultural equipment. Exempt. Church bells. Exempt. And then I found it. The Holy Grail of Malicious Compliance, subsection 4. 4. Emergency warning devices, safety alarms, and warning signals required by state or federal regulations, including but not limited to OSHA safety standards, when utilized for their intended protective purpose. I stopped reading. I read it again. I read it a third time, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the pollen. Emergency warning devices and safety alarms required by federal regulations. These were entirely 100% exempt from the local noise ordinance. It did not matter what the decibel limit was. It did not matter if it was a sudden, jarring noise. It did not matter if it woke up a deaf Yorkie. If a noise was tied to a federally mandated safety alarm, the town of Cary had zero jurisdiction to stop it. Federal law supersedes local municipal codes every single time. A massive, wicked grin spread across my face. Brenda wanted to play with municipal ordinances. I was about to introduce her to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I opened a new tab. I went to the North Carolina Secretary of State website. I clicked on Register a New Business Entity. I filled out the forms with lightning speed. I didn't need a massive corporation. I just needed a legal entity attached to my property. I entered my home address. For the specific location of the business operations, I listed the square footage of my detached garage. Business name, Sovereign Metal Works, LLC. Nature of business, custom metal fabrication and heavy machinery operation. I paid the $125 expedited filing fee with my credit card. Within 24 hours, my garage would legally be a commercial fabrication shop. Next, I pulled up the OSHA regulations database. I searched for Standard 1910.165, Employee Alarm Systems. I read through the requirements. OSHA mandates that if a workplace has loud machinery or hazardous conditions, it must have an emergency alarm system. But it can't just be any alarm. According to 1910.165b2, the employee alarm shall be capable of being perceived above ambient noise or light levels by all employees in the affected portions of the workplace. I paused, tapping my fingers on my desk. If I am running a heavy metal fabrication shop in my garage, with grinders and welders and compressors, the ambient noise level is going to be incredibly high. A standard smoke detector beep isn't going to cut it. A standard commercial fire bell isn't going to cut it. To comply with federal OSHA standards, I needed an alarm that could pierce through industrial-level noise. I needed something robust. I needed something catastrophic. I needed a train horn. I immediately opened another tab and went to an industrial surplus supplier. I bypassed the truck horns and the air raid sirens. I went straight to the railway section. There it was, the Nathan Air Chime Kivel A. This wasn't a novelty item. This was the exact 5-chime cast aluminum horn used on Amtrak passenger trains and freight locomotives across the country. It was designed to clear railway crossings from 2 miles away. It operated at 130 pounds per square inch and produced a 5-chord blast that hit 114 decibels at 100 feet. At close range, it was the acoustic equivalent of a physical blow to the chest. It was $1,800. I added it to my cart without a second thought. But I couldn't just install a train horn and blast it whenever I felt like it. That would be a nuisance violation. It had to be a safety alarm. It had to be triggered by a genuine workplace hazard. What constitutes a hazard in a metal shop? A sudden distraction. A concussive event that could cause a worker to slip while holding a plasma cutter. A concussive event, like a sneeze. I pivoted my research to acoustic engineering hardware. I needed a way to link my biological sneeze to the industrial air compressor that would power the train horn. I found an advanced, programmable sound-activated relay switch used in theatrical stage productions. It allowed the user to input a specific audio profile, a distinct pitch, volume, and frequency threshold. When the microphone detected that exact acoustic signature, it would close a circuit and trigger an electrical output. I could calibrate the relay microphone to ignore the sound of power tools, talking, or music. I could program it to exclusively recognize the exact decibel level and frequency of my own sneeze. The logic was legally flawless. My garage is Sovereign Metalworks, LLC. As a commercial shop, I am bound by OSHA regulations. A sudden, massive sneeze is an unpredictable acoustic distraction that poses a severe safety hazard while operating heavy machinery. Therefore, when a sneeze occurs, the federal safety mandate requires an immediate automated evacuation alarm to sound, ensuring all personnel stop working and clear the area. Because the shop is noisy, the alarm must be a 114 decibel, Nathan K. 5L. A locomotive horn to be perceived above the ambient machinery noise. Because it is a federally mandated safety alarm, it is entirely exempt from Cary Municipal Code, Section 22-105. I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the order confirmation screen for the train horn. I was going to legally transform my bodily functions into a weapon of mass acoustic destruction. Every time I sneezed, the relay would trip, the circuit would close, a 120-gallon air compressor would dump its payload into the K5LA, and the sound of a 4,000-ton freight train would violently announce my allergies to the entire neighborhood. Brenda wanted me to muffle my sneezes. I was going to amplify them to the level of a tactical airstrike. And the best part? The Cary Police Department, the Code Enforcement Board, and the Homeowners Association would be absolutely powerless to stop me. I clicked Confirm Purchase. The horn was on its way. Now I just needed to find a contractor crazy enough to help me build this monstrosity. Finding someone to install industrial train infrastructure on a residential garage in a strict HOA-adjacent neighborhood is honestly harder than you might think. I spent the next 3 days calling every local plumber, HVAC technician, and general contractor within a 50-mile radius of Cary. I would get them on the phone, explain that I needed a 120-gallon commercial air compressor hardwired into a residential sub-panel, and then, very casually, mention that the payload was a 5-chime locomotive horn meant for the roof. Most of them hung up on me. A few thought it was a prank call. One guy literally asked if I was building a doomsday bunker and told me he didn't want any part of a militia. I was starting to think I would have to figure out the pneumatics myself, which was a terrifying prospect considering the amount of pressurized air required to power a Nathan Airchime K5LA. Could easily turn a PVC pipe into a lethal projectile. But then, on the 4th day of searching, I found a listing for an independent industrial pneumatic contractor. No website, just a phone number and a brutally simple business name. Mike's Air and Iron. I called the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring over the sound of grinding metal. I gave him the pitch. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told him I needed to mount a genuine Amtrak horn to the roof of a suburban garage, powered by the largest compressor he could legally source, triggered by a highly sensitive acoustic relay switch. The line went dead silent for a solid 10 seconds. All I could hear was the faint hum of his grinder in the background. Finally, he spoke. "I'll be there in an hour," Mike said, and hung up. 62 minutes later, a heavily dented, diesel-gurgling Ford F350 backed into my driveway. It left a faint streak of oil on the concrete, which I didn't even care about because the man who stepped out of the truck looked like he had been born with a socket wrench in his hand. Mike was a massive, burly guy, probably in his early 50s, with a thick, completely unruly gray beard, grease-stained Carhartt overalls, and a look in his eyes that screamed he had zero patience for any nonsense. He didn't even knock on the door. He just stood in the driveway, looking at my closed garage, then slowly panned his head to look at Brenda's pristine, 2-story colonial house next door. I walked out to meet him. "You Mike?" He didn't shake my hand. He just pointed a calloused finger at my roofline. "You want me to mount a locomotive horn on your garage roof?" "Yes," I said, keeping my face completely straight. "It's an OSHA mandated evacuation alarm for my new metal fabrication shop." Mike looked at my garage. It was white aluminum siding with a decorative weather vane on top. It looked like a place where someone would store gardening tools and maybe an antique rocking chair. It did not look like a metal fabrication shop. He looked back at me. Then, he looked over the 6-foot privacy fence, right at the exact window I knew belonged to Brenda's master bedroom. He stared at it for a long moment. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He was calculating the distance, the acoustics, the sheer, unadulterated chaos of what I was asking him to do. Slowly, the corners of his mouth twitched. The twitch evolved into a smirk, and then his entire face broke into a massive, terrifyingly joyous grin. "I'm routing a 120-gallon 2-stage rotary screw compressor for this," Mike said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper of pure excitement. "It's going to shake the foundation." "That is exactly the goal, Mike," I said. "Federal safety regulations demand that the alarm be perceived above all ambient noise." "Right, federal regulations," Mike chuckled, walking past me and slapping the side of my garage. "Let's crack open this shop and see what kind of voltage we're working with." The build took 4 days, and it was a masterpiece of over-engineering. I practically moved into the garage to watch Mike work. The first thing we had to do was upgrade the electrical panel. A residential 110-volt outlet was not going to cut it for the kind of heavy machinery Mike was bringing in. We had an electrician come out and pull a massive 220-volt line straight from the street, burying the conduit under my lawn so the HOA wouldn't have a heart attack. Then, the compressor arrived. It was delivered on a flatbed truck and required a pallet jack to move it into the garage. It was a terrifying piece of industrial machinery, painted bright safety orange, taking up half the floor space. It looked like a piece of an active submarine. When Mike fired it up for the first time just to test the seals, the vibration rattled the teeth in my skull. "That's just the baseline!" Mike yelled over the deafening hum of the motor. "Wait until we hook up the lung." The lung arrived in a heavily padded wooden crate 2 days later. The Nathan Air Chime K5LA. When I pried the top off the crate and pulled away the packing peanuts, I actually gasped. It was gorgeous. 5 separate cast aluminum bells, painted a sleek, utilitarian black, mounted to a massive central manifold. It weighed roughly 50 pounds and felt like holding a piece of heavy artillery. "Beautiful," Mike muttered, wiping grease off his hands with a rag as he stared down into the crate. "You know they use these to clear livestock off the tracks in the Midwest from 3 miles out, right?" "I'm hoping it clears the negative energy off my property line," I replied. The installation of the horn was an architectural challenge. We couldn't just screw it into the roof shingles. The sheer physical recoil of the air blast would rip the plywood right off the rafters. Mike ended up building a custom steel subframe inside the attic space of the garage, bolting it directly to the load-bearing joists. He then bored a 3-inch hole through the roof, running a massive, steel-braided pneumatic line up to the peak. We mounted the K5LA so it sat perfectly level, pointing aggressively, yet legally, across my property line. To anyone driving by on the street, it just looked like a weird, slightly oversized attic vent. But if you knew what you were looking at, it was a weapon of mass disruption. The final piece of the puzzle was the acoustic relay. This was where the real malicious compliance lived or died. I had ordered a theater-grade, sound-activated switch, the kind they use to trigger pyrotechnics when a specific bass note drops during a stadium concert. I wired it into the garage's main circuitry, linking the microphone input directly to the pneumatic solenoid valve on the compressor's holding tank. "All right," Mike said, wiping his brow as he finished tightening the last brass fitting on the solenoid. "The air is live. The tank is holding at 130 psi. The electrical is hot. You throw that relay switch and the valve opens. The tank dumps. The neighborhood cries." "Let's tune it," I said, pulling up the acoustic software on my laptop. The calibration phase took an entire afternoon, and honestly, if anyone had been watching me through the window, they would have called a psychiatric hospital. I had to train the software to recognize my exact sneeze, and only my sneeze. It couldn't trigger if I dropped a wrench. It couldn't trigger if I clapped my hands. It couldn't trigger if Brenda yelled over the fence. It had to be a biometric match. I stood in the center of the garage, holding a highly sensitive decibel meter in one hand, staring at the waveform monitor on my laptop screen. "Okay, test 1, I said to Mike, who was standing by the emergency shutoff valve, wearing heavy-duty industrial ear protection. I inhaled sharply. "Achoo!" I forced a fake sneeze. It sounded terrible. It sounded like a cartoon character. The software registered a small spike, but the relay stayed green. The circuit didn't close. "Too sharp," I muttered, adjusting the frequency threshold slider on the screen. "It needs more bass. My real sneezes have a guttural drag to them." "Try to put your chest into it," Mike suggested, adjusting his earmuffs, "like you're trying to dislodge a golf ball from your windpipe." I nodded. I closed my eyes. I pictured the yellow pine pollen. I pictured Brenda's smug face. I took a deep breath, expanded my diaphragm, and let loose the most aggressive, theatrical, full-bodied fake sneeze I could muster. Choo! The waveform on the screen spiked into the red. The software analyzed the frequency. It matched the parameters. Click. The relay tripped from green to red. Instantly, the solenoid valve snapped open. The massive 120-gallon tank dumped its highly pressurized payload into the steel-braided line. I didn't just hear the sound. I felt it. It hit me in the sternum like a physical shockwave. The 5-chord blast of the Nathan K5LA erupted from the roof of the garage. The sheer volume was indescribable. It bypassed the eardrums entirely and vibrated the fluid in my spine. Dust fell from the rafters. The loose screwdrivers on Mike's workbench literally rattled off the edge and hit the concrete floor. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. It was an apocalyptic symphony of pressurized air, a sound so unnatural to a quiet suburban environment that my brain genuinely struggled to process what was happening. The blast lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the relay reset and the valve slammed shut. Silence rushed back into the garage, but my ears were ringing so violently I couldn't hear it. Mike pulled off his earmuffs. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, and his beard was covered in a fine layer of dust that had been shaken loose from the ceiling. "Well," Mike said, his voice sounding weirdly muffled through my temporary deafness. I think that meets the federal safety requirement for being perceived above ambient noise. I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. I was clutching my stomach, tears streaming down my face. We had done it. We had successfully weaponized a biological function. I paid Mike his fee, added a generous tip, and watched him drive his F350 out of the neighborhood, a massive grin still plastered on his face. The trap was set. The hardware was live. The legal paperwork was meticulously filed and sitting in a 3-inch binder on my desk. Now, all I had to do was wait for nature to take its course. Saturday morning dawned bright, clear, and absolutely saturated with pollen. It was the perfect storm. The wind had picked up overnight, blowing a fresh wave of yellow dust off the pine trees and settling it heavily over the entire cul-de-sac. The air was practically glowing. I woke up, poured myself a cup of coffee, and checked the system. The compressor gauge read a perfect 130 psi. The relay switch was glowing a steady, reassuring green. The laptop monitor showed the acoustic waveform, flatlining in the quiet morning air. Sovereign Metalworks was officially open for business. I walked out my front door and stepped onto the driveway. I glanced over the privacy fence. Brenda was out there. Of course she was. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and Brenda was currently engaged in her favorite weekend activity, kneeling in the dirt, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat, aggressively planting petunias while undoubtedly judging the landscaping choices of everyone else on the block. Barnaby, the deaf Yorkie, was asleep on a small outdoor patio cushion, completely oblivious to the world. I took a sip of my coffee. I looked up at the sky. I didn't have to force it this time. The pollen was so thick I could practically taste it on my tongue. I felt the familiar, inevitable tickle start deep in the bridge of my nose. It grew rapidly. The pressure built behind my eyes. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the maiden voyage. I didn't try to stifle it. I didn't turn my head. I didn't reach for a tissue. I leaned back, faced the sky, and surrendered to my biology. Achoo! It was a magnificent sneeze, loud, resonant, completely genuine. Less than a millisecond later, the microphone in the garage picked up the exact acoustic signature. The software processed the waveform. The parameters matched perfectly. Click! The relay tripped. I didn't even have time to open my eyes before the world exploded. Hun! The blast of the Amtrak 5L. A locomotive horn ripped through the quiet Saturday morning like a physical tear in the fabric of reality. It was so loud, it felt like a physical assault. The immediate aftermath was pure, unadulterated chaos. A flock of pigeons that had been resting on a nearby telephone wire didn't just fly away. They practically teleported in 50 different directions, dropping feathers in sheer panic. Across the street, the shockwave triggered the sensitive anti-theft alarm on a parked Honda Civic, its sirens immediately joining the symphony of destruction. And Brenda. I peered over the fence just in time to witness the majestic spectacle. The sudden, earth-shattering wall of sound hit her like a freight train. She gasped, dropped her plastic gardening trowel, clutched her sun hat, and literally lost her balance. She tipped backward, her arms flailing wildly, and fell square into a massive, thorny rhododendron bush. Barnaby the Yorkie, being entirely deaf, didn't even twitch. He continued to sleep peacefully. The horn blasted for its programmed 3 seconds, echoing down the street and bouncing off the houses. Before the valve slammed shut, the sudden silence that followed was heavy, ringing, and absolute. broken only by the wailing of the Honda Civic's car alarm across the street, and the frantic rustling of leaves as Brenda struggled to extract herself from the shrubbery. "My God!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking as she finally tumbled out of the bush, leaves stuck in her hair, her pristine athleisure wear covered in dirt. She looked around frantically, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "What was that? Was that a bomb? Is it an earthquake?" She spun around and locked eyes with me. I was standing in my driveway, calmly taking a sip of my coffee. "Good morning, Brenda," I said smoothly. "Pollen is really bad today, huh?" Her mouth dropped open. She looked from me to the roof of my garage and back to me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The redness in her face went from a panicked flush to a deep, dangerous magenta. "You!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You terrorist! What did you do? You just detonated something on your property." "I didn't detonate anything, Brenda," I said, resting my elbows on the fence line. "I sneezed, and my federally mandated OSHA safety protocol responded accordingly. I have to say the system works flawlessly. I feel very safe right now." "I am calling the police!" she shrieked, scrambling up the stairs to her back deck. "I am calling the fire department! I am calling Homeland Security! You are going to jail!" She slammed the sliding glass door so hard I thought the pane was going to shatter. I calmly walked back inside, went to my office, and picked up the 3-inch binder. It was showtime. It didn't take 32 minutes for the police to arrive this time. It took 8. And it wasn't just a standard cruiser. An SUV tore around the corner of the cul-de-sac, tires screeching slightly, followed closely by a second unit. This time it wasn't just Officer Davis and the rookie. A sergeant stepped out of the lead vehicle. He looked incredibly tense. When dispatch gets a call from a hysterical woman claiming her neighbor just set off an explosive device that sounded like a train derailing in her backyard, they tend to take it somewhat seriously. The sergeant marched up my driveway, his hand resting cautiously on his duty belt. Brenda was already running across her lawn, screaming incoherently, practically tripping over her own feet to get to him first. "Arrest him!" she was yelling. "He built a weapon! He built an acoustic weapon to terrorize me and my baby!" I stepped out onto the porch, holding my binder. "Sir, stay right there," the sergeant commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Are you the homeowner?" "I am, Sergeant," I said, holding my hands up where he could see them. "We received a report of a loud explosion or an industrial horn coming from this address," he said, eyeing my garage suspiciously. "What exactly is going on here?" "He blew up his garage," Brenda interjected, clutching the sergeant's sleeve. "He's trying to deafen me." "Ma'am, please step back," the sergeant ordered, brushing her hand away. He looked back at me. "Explain. Now." "There was no explosion, Sergeant," I said calmly. "What my neighbor heard was the automated emergency evacuation alarm for my commercial metal fabrication shop." The sergeant paused. He looked at my house. He looked at my white aluminum garage. "Your commercial metal fabrication shop in a residential cul-de-sac." "Yes, sir," I said, walking down the steps and handing him the binder. "Sovereign Metal Works, LLC, officially registered with the state of North Carolina. As a commercial facility operating heavy machinery, I am bound by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulations." The sergeant slowly took the binder. He opened it. He saw the LLC registration. He saw the tax ID number. He flipped the page and saw the highlighted printout of OSHA Standard 1910.165. "According to federal law," I continued, speaking clearly and loudly enough for Brenda to hear every word, "my shop must have an automated safety alarm capable of being perceived above all ambient noise in the event of a sudden, dangerous distraction. This morning, I experienced a violent biological distraction, a sneeze. The acoustic relay detected the hazard and deployed the alarm exactly as federally mandated to ensure all personnel safely evacuated the area. The sergeant stared at the paper. He read the OSHA requirement. He read the receipt for the acoustic relay. He read the receipt for the Nathan air chime K5LA. He slowly closed the binder and looked at me. His expression was a mix of profound annoyance and grudging, absolute awe. He realized exactly what I had done. "You attached a train horn to a sneeze detector," he said slowly. "An OSHA-compliant safety alarm, sir," I corrected him politely. "This is insane," Brenda screamed, stepping forward again. "I don't care what his fake papers say. He is violating the carry noise ordinance. Your officers told him on Tuesday that he couldn't make jarring noises. Arrest him for disturbing the peace." The sergeant sighed. It was a deep, soul-weary sigh. He turned to Brenda. "Ma'am," he said heavily, "I can't." "What do you mean you can't?" she demanded. "Because," the sergeant said, tapping my binder, "according to Cary Municipal Code Section 22-105, subsection 4, emergency warning devices and safety alarms required by federal regulations are completely exempt from local noise ordinances." Brenda froze. The color completely drained from her face. "No, that's not true. You're making that up." "It's the law, ma'am," the sergeant said, handing the binder back to me. "Local police cannot issue a citation for a federally mandated safety device. It supersedes our jurisdiction. If I write him a ticket for an OSHA alarm, the judge will throw it out, and the city will get sued." But he just did it to spite me," she sputtered, tears of sheer frustration welling in her eyes. "He just sneezed. It wasn't an emergency." "Ma'am," the sergeant said, his voice lowering to a tone that warned her she was pushing her luck. "Unless you have a degree in acoustic safety engineering and want to formally challenge his hazard protocols in federal court, there is nothing the Cary Police Department can do here. He is operating within the legal limits of the law." The sergeant turned back to me. "Sir, is there going to be a lot of hazards in your shop today?" "I don't believe so, Sergeant," I smiled. "I took a Claritin. The work environment should be quite safe for the rest of the afternoon." "See that it is?" he said. He gave me a look that perfectly communicated you are a menace to society, but you have the paperwork to prove it, tipped his hat, and walked back to his SUV. Brenda was left standing in the middle of my driveway, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She had no words. Her ultimate weapon, the police, the ordinances, the HOA bylaws, had just been completely neutralized by a 3-inch binder and an airtight interpretation of federal YIA law. She turned on her heel, power-walked back to her house, and slammed the door. I stood in my driveway, breathing in the yellow, pollen-filled air. It tasted like victory. The horn was live. The law was on my side. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was going to escalate this to the city. She was going to try and bring down Sovereign Metalworks. But I was ready for her. I had the air compressor topped off, the relay switch primed, and a whole lot of allergies left in my system. Let the code enforcement games begin. Honestly, for about 2.5 weeks, the cul-de-sac was like a ghost town, and I mean that literally. Brenda didn't even come outside. Her petunias were practically dying of thirst, but she refused to step foot in her own backyard. I guess she was terrified that the sheer friction of her opening her sliding glass door might trigger my allergies and summon the Amtrak Express again. I went about my business, grabbed my mail, drank my coffee on the porch, and occasionally coughed very loudly just to see the blinds on her living room window snap shut. It was peaceful. It was glorious. But I knew, deep down, that a Karen of Brenda's magnitude doesn't just retreat. She regroups. She was plotting. The official declaration of war arrived on a Thursday via certified mail. I literally had to sign for it from the postal worker, who gave me a very weird look. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope from the town of Cary Code Enforcement Board and the Municipal Zoning Commission. Inside was a violently formal notice of hearing. Brenda hadn't just filed a complaint. She had escalated this to a full-blown municipal tribunal. She was petitioning the city to revoke Sovereign Metalworks' operating permit, condemn my pneumatic safety system as an illegal public nuisance, and fine me heavily for, I quote, reckless endangerment of a residential community via industrialized sonic weaponry. I mean, you have to respect the vocabulary. She really went all out. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the main municipal building. I spent the weekend preparing. I didn't just bring my 3-inch binder this time. I built a legal fortress. I printed out every single federal precedent regarding OSHA jurisdiction over municipal bylaws. I printed out the exact acoustic schematics of the Nathan K5 LA horn. And most importantly, I drafted a very specific, legally binding document of my own. I called my lawyer buddy, Dave, had him review it, and got it notarized. I was ready. The Cary Municipal Building is literally the most sterile, depressing environment you can possibly imagine. It smells like old floor wax, cheap laser printer toner, and the crushed dreams of people trying to get permits for a deck expansion. I walked into Chamber B, which looked like a discount courtroom. There was a raised dais at the front where 5 board members sat, looking like they would rather be literally anywhere else. To the side sat the city attorney, a guy in a cheap gray suit who looked like he had been auditing tax returns since the Reagan administration. Brenda was already there, sitting at one of the petitioner tables. She was wearing a very sensible, very aggressive navy blue pantsuit. She had her own binder, and she was glaring at me with the kind of intense, burning hatred usually reserved for war criminals. I took my seat at the respondent table, placed my binder down, and gave her a polite, neighborly nod. She practically hissed at me. "All right, let's call this meeting to order." The chairman, a balding guy named Davies, who looked exhausted before the day had even begun, mumbled into his microphone. "We are here to review petition, 409B, Higgins versus Sovereign Metalworks, LLC, regarding a noise and zoning dispute. Mrs. Higgins, you have the floor. Please state your grievance for the record." Brenda stood up. She took a deep, theatrical breath. I could tell she had rehearsed this in the mirror for weeks. "Mr. Chairman, members of the board," she began, her voice quivering with perfectly manufactured emotional trauma. "I am here today because I am a hostage in my own home. My neighbor has installed a military-grade industrial train horn on the roof of his garage, pointing directly at my property. 2 weeks ago, he detonated this device without warning. The sheer acoustic force was so violent that it knocked me into a bush, caused property damage across the street, and completely traumatized my baby." She paused to pull a tissue from her purse and dabbed her completely dry eyes. The board members leaned forward. The city attorney started taking notes. You drop the word baby in a municipal hearing, and suddenly everyone cares. "My baby," Brenda continued, her voice breaking, "was sleeping peacefully outside." The sudden, catastrophic explosion of sound startled him so severely that his delicate nervous system was compromised. He was trembling. He was disoriented. I honestly thought he was going to have a heart attack, I am terrified to even let him outside to play. I am begging this city to enforce its noise ordinances. This man is exploiting a loophole to run a fake business just so he can torture me and my infant child." She sat down, burying her face in her hands. It was a stellar performance. I mean, if I didn't know the truth, I would have hated me too. Chairman Davies looked at me with deep, profound disgust. The other board members were shaking their heads. "Mr. Davies checked his paperwork. "Sir, the respondent, you represent Sovereign Metalworks?" "I am the owner and lead fabricator, Mr. Chairman," I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. "Did you or did you not install a locomotive horn on a residential garage and trigger it at approximately 9:15 a.m. on a Saturday morning?" the city attorney asked, leaning into his microphone. His tone was sharp, accusatory. He thought he had a slam dunk. "I did, sir," I answered plainly. "The horn is the automated emergency evacuation alarm for my commercial shop, triggered by an acoustic relay to warn of sudden concussive hazards, as mandated by OSHA Standard 1910.165. "We read your police report, sir," the city attorney scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You claim the hazard was a sneeze. You are attempting to circumvent residential noise ordinances under the guise of federal workplace safety. It is a sham, sir, a transparent sham. And more importantly, you are causing severe emotional distress to a minor. Mrs. Higgins has testified that your stunt traumatized her baby." "Yes," I said, my voice perfectly level. "About that baby. I would like to ask the petitioner a clarifying question for the official record, if the board permits." Chairman Davies frowned. "Make it quick. We have a lot of zoning variances to get through today." I turned to Brenda. She glared. At me, her chin raised defiantly. "Mrs. Higgins," I said loudly, ensuring the court stenographer caught every single syllable. "You stated under oath just now that my safety alarm completely traumatized your baby, correct?" "Yes, it did," she snapped. "He was absolutely terrified." "I am so sorry to hear that," I said, feigning deep sympathy. "Could you please tell the board the name and age of your baby?" Brenda hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her eyes. She looked at the chairman, then at the city attorney, then back at me. His name is Barnaby." "Barnaby," I repeated, nodding slowly. "And how old is baby Barnaby?" He is 14, she stammered, her face turning red. The chairman's eyebrows shot up. 14? Ma'am, you have a 14-year-old child sleeping in a playpen in the yard? Well, I interjected, turning back to the board. I think the confusion here, Mr. Chairman, is the species of the baby. Mrs. Higgins, for the official municipal record, under penalty of perjury, is Barnaby a human child, or is Barnaby a 14-year-old Yorkshire Terrier who is legally blind and entirely deaf? The room went dead silent. You could literally hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. The city attorney stopped writing. Chairman Davies slowly took off his reading glasses and stared at Brenda. "Mrs. Higgins?" the chairman asked, his voice suddenly very, very flat. "Is your baby a dog?" "He is a member of my family!" Brenda shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. "He is my fur child, and the kinetic vibrations of that acoustic weapon still startled his fragile bones. It doesn't matter if he's a dog, it's the principle of the matter." Davies rubbed his temples. The disgust he had directed at me 5 minutes ago had entirely shifted to the woman who had just wasted the city's time by perjuring herself over a deaf terrier. Regardless of the canine nature of the victim, the city attorney quickly stepped in, trying to salvage the case. He clearly didn't like being made to look like a fool. The town of Cary has strict ordinances against nuisance noises. Your business is operating in a residential zone. We have the authority to revoke your LLC's zoning permit and force the immediate dismantling of that horn. You are violating the quiet enjoyment of the neighborhood. This was it. This was the trap. I had been waiting for him to say exactly those words. "Actually, sir, you do not have that authority," I said, my voice hardening. I opened my massive binder. "I am operating a legally registered commercial fabrication shop. Under federal law, OSHA regulations completely preempt local and state municipal codes when it comes to workplace safety standards. The Town of Cary Code of Ordinances, Section 22-105, subsection 4, explicitly exempts federal safety alarms from your noise restrictions. We are invalidating your claim that a train horn is a necessary safety alarm," the city attorney barked back. "It is excessive. It is a public nuisance. We are ordering you to dismantle it immediately, or we will condemn the structure." "Aren't you officially ordering me, on behalf of the Cary Code Enforcement Board and the City of Cary, to dismantle a federally mandated, OSHA-compliant employee evacuation safety system?" I asked, making sure to enunciate every single word. "Yes, we are," Brenda yelled from her table. "Tell him, Mr. Caldwell." "Yes, sir, we are," the city attorney said, looking incredibly smug. "You have 48 hours to remove the device." "Understood," I said smoothly. I reached into my binder and pulled out the document I had spent the weekend drafting. I walked over to the city attorney's desk and placed it gently in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, looking down at the heavy legal paper. "That, Mr. Caldwell, is a transfer of liability waiver," I said, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear. "As you know, federal law dictates that my shop must have a functioning emergency evacuation alarm. If I remove it, my shop is no longer compliant and is therefore inherently dangerous to operate. By officially ordering the removal of this federally mandated safety equipment, the city of Cary is formally overriding federal safety protocols." I paused, letting that sink in. Caldwell was reading the document, and I could literally see the color draining from his face as his eyes tracked the paragraphs. "Therefore," I continued cheerfully, "this waiver legally transfers 100% of the financial, civil, and criminal liability to the city of Cary and its municipal officers. If I or any contractor or any future employee of Sovereign Metalworks is injured, maimed, or killed in my shop because they were not properly alerted to a concussive hazard due to the absence of the alarm you forced me to remove, the city assumes full responsibility for the wrongful death lawsuits and OSHA federal fines. All I need is your signature, Mr. Caldwell, and the signature of Chairman Davies, assuming personal and municipal liability for any workplace fatalities." I pulled a pen from my pocket and clicked it. I held it out to him. "Please, sign away." The silence that fell over Chamber B was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and beautiful. Caldwell stared at the waiver like it was a live grenade. Bureaucrats are terrified of a lot of things. They hate bad press. They hate angry voters. But above all else, above everything in the known universe, bureaucrats are absolutely, fundamentally terrified of liability. You cannot make a city official sign a document assuming financial responsibility for a hypothetical wrongful death. They will literally throw themselves out a window before putting ink on that paper. We cannot sign this," Caldwell stammered, pushing the paper back toward me as if it were physically burning him. "Why not?" I asked innocently. If you are confident that your municipal noise ordinance supersedes federal occupational safety law, then you should have no problem backing up that legal theory with municipal funds. Sign the paper, and I'll take the horn down today." Caldwell looked up at Chairman Davies. Davies looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. They were trapped. They knew it. I knew it. And honestly, even Brenda seemed to realize something had gone terribly wrong. If they ordered me to take it down without signing the waiver, I could sue them for ordering me to violate federal law. If they signed the waiver, they were opening the city to millions of dollars in potential liability over a neighborhood dispute. "Mr. Chairman," Caldwell whispered, leaning over and covering his microphone, though the acoustics of the room picked it up anyway. "We can't order him to dismantle a safety device. The liability risk it's astronomical. If he drops a plasma cutter on his foot because we made him take down the horn, he'll own this building." Davies closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and rubbed his face. He looked at Brenda, who was staring at them with wide, panicked eyes. "Do something," Brenda hissed. "Mrs. Higgins," Chairman Davies said, his voice completely devoid of any remaining patience, "the board finds that the respondent has provided sufficient documentation proving the device in question is registered as federal safety equipment. Under our own bylaws, we do not have the jurisdiction to enforce noise ordinances against OSHA-mandated alarms." "You're letting him keep it?" she screamed, leaping to her feet. "He's going to deafen my dog." "Your dog is already deaf, ma'am," Davies snapped, banging his gavel sharply. "This board is not going to expose the city to a massive federal liability lawsuit because you have a personal vendetta against your neighbor's allergies. Petition 409B is dismissed. You are instructed to resolve this civilly. We are adjourned." He banged the gavel one more time, stood up, and walked out the back door without looking back. Caldwell practically sprinted after him, leaving the liability waiver sitting lonely on the desk. I slowly packed up my binder. I clicked my pen, slid it into my pocket, and turned to look at Brenda. She was standing at her table, shaking with a level of rage that I thought might actually cause her to spontaneously combust. I gave her a polite, two-finger salute. "Have a wonderful afternoon, Brenda. Try to keep Barnaby out of the blast zone." I walked out of the municipal building into the bright North Carolina sunshine. I felt like I was floating. It wasn't just a win. It was an absolute, flawless, legal decimation. I had weaponized the system against the very people who created it. When I pulled back into my driveway an hour later, the neighborhood was quiet. The air was still thick with pollen, but it felt different now. It felt like my domain. I unlocked the garage and stepped inside. The massive orange air compressor hummed quietly in the corner, keeping the tank perfectly pressurized at 130 psi. The red light on. The acoustic relay blinked steadily, standing guard, waiting for the next biological hazard. Now, here is the thing. I am a petty man, but I am not a monster. I had won. I had the legal right to blast a 114 decibel train horn into the suburbs every time I felt a tickle in my nose, and the city could do absolutely nothing about it. But I also actually like living in my house, and I didn't want to rupture my own eardrums every spring. I walked over to the laptop, connected to the acoustic relay. I opened the calibration software. I clicked on the sensitivity threshold slider for the microphone input. I dragged it all the way down. I adjusted the parameters so drastically that moving forward, the relay would only trip if a literal, point-blank shotgun blast went off inside the garage. A sneeze wouldn't trigger it. Dropping an anvil wouldn't trigger it. The horn was still legally mounted. The system was still fully operational. It was just essentially nerfed. But here is the beautiful, diabolical part. Brenda didn't know that. As far as Brenda was concerned, That massive cast aluminum locomotive horn on my roof was a loaded cannon with a hair trigger, ready to annihilate her peace of mind the second I expelled a breath too sharply. I walked out of the garage and locked the door. I strolled over to my property line. Brenda was standing on her back deck, holding a watering can. As soon as she saw me, she froze. I looked at her. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out a travel-sized pack of tissues. I didn't even sneeze. I just held the tissue up to my nose and took a deep, theatrical breath. Brenda dropped the watering can. It clattered against the wooden deck boards, spilling water everywhere. She let out a panicked yelp, spun around, practically dove through her sliding glass door, and slammed it shut behind her. A second later, I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood there, holding my tissue, smiling from ear to ear. The sound of silence had never been so loud. Camera cuts to a direct, face-on shot in the studio. Sovereign ruling host sitting behind a sleek desk, holding a printed copy of the Cary Municipal Code. Honestly, there is nothing quite as satisfying as watching bureaucratic red tape completely strangle the person who tried to wrap you in it. I mean, we took a minor zoning dispute over seasonal allergies and escalated it into a federal occupational safety standoff, and we didn't break a single law doing it. Brenda wanted to weaponize the police to control what I did on my own property. So we weaponized the federal government to establish absolute acoustic dominance. The city council backed down because the one thing a local government fears more than an angry HOA is a lawsuit they have to pay for out of their own budget. By handing them that liability waiver, we didn't just win the argument, we checked their king. The horn is still on the roof. The compressor is still plugged in. And Brenda? She hasn't complained about a single noise since. Every time I even look like I'm going to clear my throat, she treats her house like a fallout shelter. It is, literally, the most peaceful my backyard has ever been. Remember, folks, never let a Karen tell you how to sneeze, how to breathe, or how to exist on your own land. If they want to play the legal game, make sure you bring a train horn to a knife fight. Stay sovereign, stay compliant, and I'll see you in the next one.